Well, today we're kind of moving up in this presentation from the ground up a few feet, 10,000, 30,000 feet. Um, One of the challenges to date has been getting uh, actual compiled data to be able to look at the significance of livestock grazing at broad spatial scales. And so what I'm going to be talking about today is the development of a mapping of the agent of BLM's rangeland health assessment data. Now, the agency, while it manages 20,000 allotments and 155 million acres of public lands, it conducts rangeland health assessments about every 10 years at time of permit renewal. In theory, we should be on round number 3. The program went into effect in 1997, but in fact, we have not finished completing rangeland health assessments on the 21,000 allotments. Unlike much of the information regarding allotments, the agency does not maintain any centralized database. And there's no mapping, no ability to look spatially at the land health records, which is a major shortcoming, especially as the agency pivots towards broader spatial scales, watershed and landscape scales, regional scales for both the planning and forecasting, away from just pasture and allotment scales. Now, in the rapid ecoregional assessments that I was involved in, all the contractors identified livestock grazing, of course, as a major disturbance factor, ubiquitous across the West, and certainly across the ecoregions that we were working in, both the Colorado Plateau and in the Sonoran, but as well as in the Central Basin and Range and in Northern Basin and Range. But the agency excluded from consideration inclusion of these data. They identified lack of available data as their official reason, but during the meetings, the folks relayed that there had been concern from stakeholders and also concern from the Washington office regarding potential litigation that would, in the end, put an end to the rapid ecoregions regional assessments themselves. So unfortunately, there was no complete database to look at. So the data I present today in the map reflects efforts to obtain these data from the agency through the Freedom of Information Act requests, and which we've done 3 since 2008. And collectively, it was a major pile of data dumps with roughly 75,000 records that needed to be compiled. And the goal was simply to help fill the gap that was obviously missing when the agency decided to exclude livestock grazing for reasons of lack of data. So the agency really is challenged by the scale of the lands it manages for rangeland health. And as Dr. Beshta pointed out, this is a lot of land. And for the agency not to be able to examine their data spatially is a serious problem, and one that from the very beginning they could have been tracking, both to know where they are, but where they've been in order to be better able to identify some of the challenges that they face in the future. And then the big drying and the impending climate change impacts, and that this is more important than ever. And unfortunately, though, these allotment rangeland health assessments are focused on the fine scale as opposed to broad landscape level assessments of rangeland health conditions. And unfortunately, it's terribly labor intensive, expensive, and takes so long and we just have not been able to keep up. And we have still about 25%, more than 25% of the lands yet to be assessed. And in order for us to be able to actually keep up, we're going to have to move towards a more rapid assessment approach involving remote sensing. So right now, it's really a matter of triage. We've had the time. Unfortunately, we have not been able to keep up with these assessments, and every 10 years is just insufficient in trying to maintain rangeland health conditions. And so here's an example. I took through a fly through with a program that I've been working on to show just some of the challenges we face, both on the ground as well as just the spatial scale that we need to be working with. And there's a lot of low-hanging fruit out there. We have allotments that clearly fail to meet rangeland health standards by any measure. And these are easily recognizable, and there's no reason that we can't be identifying these and making immediate adjustments to the stocking or the management plans for these allotments without having to go on the ground. And we shouldn't have the scale of the management will require this kind of quick assessment and prioritize areas for field management, field assessments and management. So why have we compiled these data externally? The agency took the only data that, as far as I know, that the agency has looked at was compiled by a Freedom of Information Act request by Western Watersheds back in 2008. And then it had to be cleaned up by USGS and examined by folks to see whether or not they might be able to shed light. These rangeland health assessment results would shed light on the broad scale management effects. There was a concern that the various differences between state standards and expertise and effective various field protocols would interfere with the ability to use these data across broad spatial scales. And since that time, even though the data have been continued to be compiled through our FOIA requests, there doesn't appear to be any interest in looking at that data or maintaining it in a central database. Now, we did pass these recommendations on to Tracy Stone Manning that really it was very important for them to digitize these data. And so the end product, and this, what you're seeing here is the product of quite a bit of effort and a lot of cups of coffee. The agency should be able to show you this itself, but they have not. And in this case, here's a map of the agency's rangeland health assessment findings. The red being allotments that have been identified as failing due to livestock grazing, and green allotments that have been identified as meeting standards, and those in gray yet to be assessed. Now, clearly, one can see that there are some distribution commonalities here. These aren't randomly distributed. And this was good news. And the one way of looking at this, just to get a general sense of the level of failure or success of management practices, was to look at the amount of failure of assessed lands of those assessed to date, of all assessed to date. And major findings, 50% of rangelands have failed, of assessed, have failed to meet land health standards. 36% associated with livestock grazing. And by far, in the agency's data, livestock grazing was the most frequently cited cause of failure. It is the most ubiquitous, of course, and and far and away more common than most of the other factors combined. And 72% of those lands failing to meet rangeland health standards identified livestock as one of the significant causes. And roughly 41 million acres remain to be assessed. However, importantly, these are in an area with high failure rates. And so it's very unlikely that when these are assessed, that this picture will change. And so this is what it looks like. By taking the area of allotments assessed, breaking it down by whether or not they've met or failed due to livestock grazing, we get a picture that begins to take shape. And in the image, I'm not sure if you can see my mouse or not, but the conditions, the greens and yellows represent a lower likelihood of any allotment being identified as failing due to livestock grazing, and those in red with a very high likelihood, in this case exceeding 30% of the lands that have been assessed to date, failing to meet livestock, failing to meet rangeland health standards, and livestock being a significant factor. Now, all of these share a common ecological characteristics. Those with the highest failure rates are all within the cold desert level 2 ecoregion, primarily the Central Basin Range, the Northern Basin Range, Snake River Plain, and Wyoming Basin, which comprise much of the lands that BLM manages for livestock grazing. And one of the values in seeing this is that the question posed by USGS as to whether or not the land health data might be able to be used for more broad regional assessments of conditions and the effectiveness of management. Their worries seem to be not borne out when looked at very coarse scales, and so this is a good thing. And even with pressures for not on the field offices not to identify allotments as failing to meet standards, still in many cases, overwhelmingly allotments are identified as failing. And so we can look at these overall as 21,000 ongoing experiments, if you will, more so looking at the differences in pasture and allotments within field offices. Everyone presumably trying to do their best and succeed, but clearly there are differences in levels of success. And another important factor is that as we've obtained more data, these general patterns have remained the same. And although there was very little data in 2008, even then, had the authors used these data and calculated in a similar fashion, they would have seen that indeed the highest likelihood of failure occurred in these cold desert ecoregions. So this gives us an opportunity, looking at it at such a broad scale, integrating all the factors that we've been discussing today, to see what works. And so clearly we have differences in levels of failure attributable to different grazing practices and stocking levels, and within the context of the resistance and resilience of these ecosystems. And so these patterns should be useful as a template to determine just how well the underlying assumptions are regarding carrying capacities and best management practices have been working over the last 2 decades, 2.5 decades almost, since this program began and since this data began to be collected. And so at what point, what constitutes too much? And how much of a failure due to livestock grazing should be a trigger alarm? And I would suggest that even a cutoff in excess of 40% will require rethinking of a very large fraction of the agency's the livestock grazing allotments that they manage. But having these generalized at broad spatial scales does allow us to make decisions broadly regarding changes in carrying capacity or livestock grazing management practices. And but this has got to happen from above. It's not going to be done at the field office level or state office level. And we need to have a major rethink on why it is that we have, as stewards, been that we have utterly failed in some of these ecoregions. And our assessments indicate that we're failing more often than not in some of these areas within the Central Basin Range, Northern Basin Range, Snake River Plain, Wyoming Basin, and Western Cordillera. So the elephant in the room, we have obviously an enormous proportion of the lands that are being managed fail. And so this does reflect on our stewardship. So what has gone wrong? And how we remedy this? Well, and why hasn't the agency taken on this effort themselves? And that is something that can only be answered by the folks at the National Operations Center and the Washington office. We have run out of time. The agency has simply chosen not to look at this. And so, unfortunately, they've missed an excellent opportunity to get out ahead of this. We're now 2 decades in, and it's unacceptable and unsustainable, and action must be taken quickly. So, what are they missing by not looking at their own data? A lot. And as one example, here are ecoregions that have livestock-related failure levels are in excess of 40%. And these areas coincide with 4 out of the 7 greater sage-grouse management zones, and a very large fraction, very large fraction of the habitat management areas. And so we have some serious problems ahead. And this is just one example, tip of the iceberg. In other cases, like this last week, for example, I was looking at Lahontan cutthroat in northern Nevada and southern Oregon, and almost all water flowing with streams, with occupied streams, flow through allotments that are identified as failing to meet standards due to livestock grazing, or through U.S. Forest Service watersheds that are functional but impaired or impaired. So what are my recommendations? Well, we must immediately go to compile and develop a formal geospatial database, ideally conducted by the USGS, who compiled their vegetation treatment data library from going to field office and combining all that vegetation treatment data and putting that into an excellent database. It's very detailed, well curated, and something similar could be done with the rangeland health data that lies gathering dust at the field offices. And then right at the moment, we can see that we have utterly failed in our mission to manage resources sustainably across a large fraction of the ecoregions and allotments in ecoregions across the cold deserts. And I can't remember which one of the speakers today, but to err on the side of caution, the easiest thing we can do is immediately reduce stocking levels on those acreages with extremely high failure due to livestock grazing. And then begin to really challenge our underlying assumptions regarding both carrying capacity as it stands now, and to be able to make predictions into the future based on the inability to manage today within the framework of the unprecedented drought and the effects of climate change. And I argue, too, that we must quickly develop a remote sensing approach to blast through and identify those allotments that currently would easily fail rangeland health standards due to livestock grazing. The low-hanging fruit, starting with those allotments that have yet to be assessed, and then progressing on to those allotments that have been identified as meeting standards but have a very old assessment, and to identify, moving on to those in the agency's selective management category, improve, which reflects both allotments that currently fail due to livestock grazing impacts or are likely to fail due to livestock grazing impacts. And that would give us a good headway into helping to plug those gaps. And we have to really encourage the agency to begin to use these data and not only collect these data, but to actually use these data and take action at national levels. But this can only come from on high. It can't be done at the field office level or even the state office level. And so that I'll just pass it on to Laura. We do have an interactive website. On the PEERS website here, I have a link to this, and it's the BLM Rangeland Health Geospatial Data Portal. And there are opportunities to look at the data and download the data, along with other data sets that you might find interesting. So with that, we'll pass it on.